I never imagined the day would come when my own daughter-in-law would drag me into court, claiming I had lost my memory just to seize everything I had built with my bare hands. In that moment, it felt like my entire life was being ripped away. Stacked in front of me were thick files, notarized seals, a doctor's signature, even a social worker's report. Together, they looked like a verdict already signed against me. The house I laid brick by brick, the savings from decades of sweat, even my freedom itself, everything could vanish with just a few sheets of paper. How could one old man possibly fight a scheme this airtight? But they forgot one thing: I have never given up. And what happened next, you will not believe. The red brick house still stood behind me, but I finally understood the real fight was only beginning. If it were you, would you trust the law on paper or the truth behind it? Comment and subscribe to hear the full story. When you live in a small Midwestern town, nothing stays secret for long. News spreads faster than the morning paper, faster than the smell of barbecue drifting through the summer air. The church, the diner, the little cafe on Main Street, those weren't just places to gather. They were the pulse of the community. And lately that pulse had been beating against me. I'm 72 years old, a self-made man. I came to this town with nothing but calloused hands and a stubborn heart. Every brick in my red brick house I laid myself. Every dollar in my savings I earned with sweat dripping down my back. For decades, people nodded when I walked by because they knew I was the man who built something from nothing. That pride, my American dream, was the one thing that kept me standing tall. But pride, I've learned, doesn't protect you from whispers. At first it was subtle. A neighbor tilting her head when I forgot where I'd left my keys. A social worker dropping by just to check in and finding me staring too long at an old photograph of my late wife. My daughter-in-law made sure those moments never went unnoticed. She had this way about her, all sweetness and light. She'd ladle chicken soup into my bowl, call me Dad with a soft smile, insist on driving me to Sunday service. To the outside world, she looked like the picture of a dutiful daughter-in-law. People at church admired her, saying she takes such good care of him. But behind closed doors, I felt the walls closing in. She'd say things like, "Dad, you shouldn't stress about the bills anymore. Why don't you let us handle the paperwork? Or you've done enough, you should rest now." Each word coated in honey, but sharp enough to pierce the skin. My son, he wasn't much better. For years, he'd been the disappointment of this town. Dropped out of school, wasted time at the bar, stumbled through jobs like they were revolving doors. Folks said he'd never amount to anything. When he married her, everyone thought he'd finally straightened out. Maybe he had. Or maybe he just found someone willing to do the scheming for him. Either way, he stood by her side, silent. That silence hurt worse than any word. I started noticing the looks in town. At the cafe, the waitress leaned over to a customer and whispered just loud enough for me to catch, "Poor man. He's not all there anymore." At a backyard barbecue, the smell of ribs heavy in the air, I overheard a neighbor mutter, "He's lucky to have them looking after him." He couldn't handle it alone. Even at the diner, my diner where I'd eaten pancakes every Saturday morning for 30 years, the regulars gave me the kind of smile you give to someone you pity. It was like the whole town was being trained to see me as less capable, less sharp, less human. And the more they saw me that way, the more I began to question myself. Was I repeating stories too often? Was I really losing track of time? Or was I being pushed into believing I was weaker than I truly was? I'd sit in my recliner at night, the smell of motor oil drifting in from the garage where I used to fix everything myself. And I'd wonder, when did I become the villain in my own town? I wanted to believe my daughter-in-law meant well. After all, who wouldn't want a family member to cook them dinner to make sure they got to church on time, to smile sweetly in front of the congregation? But something inside me, a voice as steady as the hammer I once swung, kept whispering, "This isn't care. This is control." And then there was my son, my boy who'd once let me down so many times. I looked at him standing behind her like a shadow, and I couldn't tell if he was complicit or just too broken to fight for me. Either way, it felt like betrayal. The worst part wasn't their words. It was the isolation. In a town where community is everything, being quietly pushed out of the circle cuts deeper than any knife. At church, I noticed no one sat beside me unless she was there to bridge the gap. At the diner, no one asked me about the old days anymore. Conversations stopped when I walked in. I wasn't just being doubted, I was being erased. The signs were all there, planted carefully by her hands. A misplaced bill left accidentally on the counter, a reminder to the social worker that Dad forgets sometimes. Gentle smiles masking steel trap intentions. Piece by piece, she was building a case against me, and the whole town was buying it. I didn't know it then, but what I was living through wasn't just family tension. It was a setup, a careful construction to strip me of everything I owned, everything I believed I'd secured for my legacy. And the worst part, it was working. At the local diner, whispers followed him. A waitress who had served him for 20 years now spoke in a tone reserved for patients rather than neighbors. At the barber shop, men paused mid-conversation when he entered. The gossip grew legs. Old Miller is slipping. These everyday places, once safe, now felt like courtrooms where every eye judged his sanity. At the grocery store, his steps slowed when he noticed how people glanced at him. The cashier who once joked with him about lottery tickets now offered a careful smile as if humoring a child. Two men by the magazine rack whispered, one tapping his temple and shaking his head. At Sunday service, even before the scandal broke wide, parishioners exchanged looks when he stumbled over a hymn verse. The small town he had lived in for decades suddenly felt like a stage where everyone rehearsed his decline. I wasn't born into much. My life began with nothing but dust under my nails and sweat on my brow. I was a laborer, a construction man. Day after day, I woke before the sun, the air heavy with the smell of cement. My ears filled with the relentless pounding of hammers and the grind of saws. The work was brutal. My clothes soaked through with sweat, but with every nail I drove, every brick I stacked, I told myself it would all be worth it. The red brick house I live in today isn't just a home. It's my testimony. Each brick carries the weight of a day I refused to quit. Each wall remembers my calloused hands, blistered but determined. This house was my dream made real, the American dream. I wasn't alone back then. My wife, she was the heart that kept me going. She didn't complain when the nights were long and the money was short. She'd stir a pot of stew in our tiny kitchen, humming softly, and somehow that melody carried me through the hardest days. I still remember the sound of her laughter, how it filled the house when our boy was small. But cancer has no mercy. It stole her from me. I sat by her hospital bed, the antiseptic smell burning my nose, her hand frail in mine. I promised her then I'd take care of our son no matter what. And when she passed, I walked out of that hospital with a hollow chest and a vow that weighed heavier than any brick I'd ever carried. Raising him alone wasn't easy. I worked double shifts, patched roofs on weekends, fixed cars in the evenings just to make ends meet. There were times I skipped meals so he could have new school books. I remember the pride in his eyes when I handed him his first baseball glove, even though I had sold my old tools to afford it. Everything I did was for him. But kids don't always see the sacrifices made for them. As he grew older, something changed. He began slipping through my fingers, skipping school, hanging with the wrong crowd. The sweet boy I had raised turned into a restless young man drawn to bars and bad company. I'd get late-night calls to come pick him up to bail him out of trouble. Each time I told myself he'd learn. Each time I hoped he'd turn it around. The town saw him as a failure, and when the town looks at your boy that way, it feels like they're looking at you too. I carried that shame like a weight on my shoulders, even as I kept trying to believe he'd prove them wrong. That's when I made the trust. Irrevocable trust, the lawyer called it. It wasn't just paperwork. It was my way of protecting what I'd built, of ensuring that no matter what happened, my legacy wouldn't be squandered. I told myself it was for him, for his future children, for the family name. That piece of paper was supposed to safeguard decades of sacrifice. Still, when the house grew quiet after my wife passed, pride turned into loneliness. I'd sit in the living room, the shadows longer than the daylight, and talk to her photograph as if she could still hear me. Her eyes frozen in that frame seemed to remind me, "Don't let anyone rewrite the story of your life." Those words stayed with me. I tried to keep busy. I fixed up the house, kept the yard neat, tinkered in the garage. The smell of motor oil and the sound of old jazz on the radio were my companions. But nights were the hardest. I'd lie in bed staring at the ceiling, hearing the echo of her voice telling me to stay strong. And then she came, the daughter-in-law. At first I thought she was a blessing. She was warm, attentive, always smiling. She filled the kitchen with the smell of home-cooked meals, insisted I sit and rest while she did the chores. After years of silence, the house had laughter again, and for a brief moment I let myself believe maybe I wasn't alone anymore. But even blessings can turn into burdens when their sweetness feels rehearsed. Her kindness was always just a little too perfect, her concern a little too insistent. And slowly I realized she wasn't just filling the house with food and chatter. She was rewriting the narrative one careful gesture at a time. She'd remind the social worker Dad sometimes forgets his pills. She'd whisper to neighbors, "He gets confused now and then." And the worst part? People believed her. My own sacrifices, my own story began to blur beneath the version she told. I had promised my wife I wouldn't let anyone erase me. But as the days passed, I could feel it happening anyway, like ink bleeding off a page, until nothing of the original words remained. The red brick house stood strong, but inside my foundation was under attack. I remember the night the roof leaked during a storm. Buckets lined the hallway, his wife laughing as the children turned it into a game, catching raindrops in coffee mugs. Another time they argued over the color of the bricks. She wanted cream, he insisted on red. Years later, those red walls became her favorite. These ordinary moments cemented the house as more than shelter. It was memory incarnate. I remember a picnic long ago at the county park. His wife packed fried chicken and lemonade, their young son running barefoot across the grass. At sunset, she whispered, "Promise me this house will always hold our family." Later that night, my son, still sticky from melted ice cream, asked innocently, "Dad, will this house always be ours?" Those words etched themselves into his memory as surely as any brick in the walls. When I first saw the stack of papers, my hands trembled, not because I was weak, but because I knew how strong they looked. Thick reports stamped with official seals, a doctor's note claiming I suffered from cognitive decline, even the signature of a notary public pressed into the corner of the page. It was the kind of evidence that would make any judge pause, the kind of evidence that stripped me of my voice before I even opened my mouth. The doctor who signed it wasn't just any physician. He was a friend of my daughter-in-law, a man whose clinic had already been whispered about for shady Medicare claims. But a piece of paper doesn't reveal backroom deals. A notarized stamp doesn't explain friendships forged in shadows. To the outside world, it looked legitimate, ironclad. And then there was the social worker's evaluation. She nodded gravely as she described how I forgot my pills or repeated stories. What she didn't know, or maybe didn't care to see, was that those moments had been staged. My daughter-in-law had made sure I appeared forgetful. She'd swap the pillbox around, move my glasses, interrupt me mid-sentence, then helpfully point it out in front of witnesses. Little traps laid carefully so the story of my decline could be told without me saying a word. But none of it compared to what happened in church. It was a Sunday morning like any other. The air smelled faintly of polished wood and old hymnals. Sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, painting the congregation in blues and reds. The organ played softly, and for a moment I felt a peace I hadn't known in weeks. Then she stood up. My daughter-in-law, with her Bible pressed to her chest and a folded sheet of paper in her hand. She walked to where I sat near the front, her heels clicking against the stone floor. All eyes followed her. "Dad," she said sweetly, loud enough for everyone to hear, "I brought something for you to sign, just so we can help manage things better." She opened the paper and laid it across my lap. A power of attorney form. The church went silent. Even the organist missed a note. I looked around. The familiar faces of neighbors, people I'd prayed beside for decades, stared back at me with a mix of pity and expectation. I shook my head. Not here. Not like this. Whispers rippled through the pews. Someone coughed, and then from the back a man's voice rang out with a verse I'd heard 1,000 times, "Honor thy father and mother." The irony cut through me like a knife. They thought I was the dishonorable one. They thought I was refusing the care of the children I had sacrificed everything for. I pushed the paper back toward her. My voice cracked, but I made sure it carried, "I will not sign this." Her eyes glistened with tears that looked rehearsed. She clutched the paper to her chest and whispered just loud enough for the front rows to hear, "I only wanted to help." And my son, my boy, stood off to the side silent. He didn't defend me, didn't step forward, didn't say a word. His silence roared louder than the whispers, louder than the organ, louder than my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. In that moment, it wasn't just a piece of paper I refused. It was a declaration that I wasn't ready to surrender. But to everyone watching it, looked like the stubborn pride of an old man who couldn't accept reality. As the congregation rose for the next hymn, I stayed seated staring at the stained glass as if it could hold me up. My daughter-in-law slipped the paper back into her Bible and patted my shoulder with false tenderness. My son avoided my eyes, and I knew then the courtroom wasn't the only battlefield. The war had already begun right there in the house of God. After that Sunday, the whispers never stopped. They followed me out of the church and into every corner of town, curling like smoke I couldn't escape. At the cafe on Main Street, where I once drank coffee and traded stories about construction jobs, the waitress leaned in close to a customer as I walked by. Her voice was low, but not low enough. "Poor man, he's slipping, you know. Good thing his family's stepping in." The customer nodded solemnly, and they both looked at me with that same pitying half-smile. At a neighbor's barbecue, the smell of ribs and charcoal heavy in the air, I overheard someone mutter, "He should be grateful. Most old folks don't have anyone willing to take care of them." I set my plate down and left before dessert was even served. Even the diner, my diner where I'd sat every Saturday morning for 30 years, was no refuge. The regulars didn't ask me about the old days anymore. Conversations hushed the moment I walked in. It was as though my presence embarrassed them, like I'd become some tragic figure to be pitied but not engaged. And then came the newspaper. The local headline read, "Elderly man refuses care, risks family trust." My name wasn't in bold, but everyone knew. Small towns don't need names when the story fits the gossip too well. People folded their papers, shook their heads, and confirmed what they already believed I was the problem. Humiliation wasn't confined to sidewalks and pews anymore. It followed me into the digital world too. On the town's Facebook community group, comments popped up beneath a photo of my daughter-in-law helping me carry groceries. Such a devoted woman. Bless her heart dealing with that stubborn old man. And the worst one, he only cares about money, not family. Dozens of likes beneath it. I read those words alone at my kitchen table, the glow of the screen cold against my face. My chest tightened not from age, but from the realization that I was losing more than dignity. I was losing my story. One night I turned on the radio, hoping for some distraction. Instead, the local talk host was discussing the dangers of elderly folks refusing help. He didn't say my name, but I could hear myself in every example. "Some seniors just can't admit when it's time to step aside," he said, his voice dripping with certainty. Callers phoned in to agree one after another. The static of the radio felt like it was drilling into my skull. I switched it off and sat in silence. The house creaked around me, the red bricks holding firm even as I felt my own foundation crumbling. For the first time, I questioned myself. Was I repeating stories too often? Did I forget more than I admitted? Was my daughter-in-law right? That doubt, small at first, spread like rot, and I hated her for planting it. But the town didn't see manipulation. They saw evidence, papers with seals, doctors with titles, a daughter-in-law with a trembling voice and wet eyes. All I had was my word, and in the court of public opinion, my word was worth less than a notarized lie. Even my lawyer warned me. He leaned across his desk, the smell of stale coffee between us, and said, "You need to prepare yourself. This could drag on for a year, maybe longer, and it will cost you tens of thousands. In this state, guardianship law is strict. The burden is on you to prove your competence. Tens of thousands. For a man who'd pinched every penny, skipped meals, sold tools to buy his son's baseball glove, the thought of bleeding out my savings in court was almost as painful as losing the case." I walked home that evening with the sky turning gray and heavy above me. The sidewalks felt narrower, the glances from neighbors sharper. A group of kids on bicycles rode past, their laughter echoing. One of them shouted, "Crazy old man," whether he meant me or not, it didn't matter. The words stuck. Inside my garage, the air smelled of oil and rust. I stared at the photograph of my wife pinned to the wall, her smile frozen in time. I heard her voice again. "Don't let anyone rewrite the story of your life." But I felt powerless, outnumbered, outmaneuvered. My daughter-in-law had orchestrated every move like a chess master. The town, the church, the media, they were her pawns, all arranged to box me in. My son stood silently beside her, and I was left wondering if he was a piece on her board too. I thought about the trust I'd created, the legacy I believed was secure. Now it seemed like just another piece of paper waiting to be torn apart in court. and in that moment, sitting in the garage with shadows stretching long across the floor, I believed the war was already lost. What chance does one old man have against an army of lies? In the town's Facebook group, a post appeared. Saw Mr. Miller wandering Main Street, looked confused. Dozens of comments piled on some sympathetic, others cruel. The local radio host joked about the mayor of confusion during a morning show. These weren't just rumors. They were broadcast narratives shaping how the town perceived him. The ridicule spread further. On a local radio station, the morning DJ chuckled about the town's confused grandpa losing his way again. Online, a meme circulated in the community Facebook group, his photo cropped from a church fundraiser with captions mocking his memory. Comments piled up, some pitying, others cruel. He saw it once on his grandson's phone and felt his chest tighten. This was no longer private family tension, it was public theater. I used to think memory was like brick and mortar. Once you laid it, it stayed. But lately I began to question even myself. Was it me who misplaced the bill on the counter, or had she moved it? Did I forget my keys, or had someone quietly slid them beneath a stack of magazines? When the mind is attacked from the outside, long enough you start to doubt whether the cracks are your own or someone else's hammer at work. Nights were the worst. Alone in my red brick house, I'd lie in bed and hear my wife's voice faint as a whisper. Sometimes she'd remind me of the promise I made by her hospital bed. Don't let anyone rewrite the story of your life. But then her voice would twist, warped, sharp, sounding eerily like my daughter-in-law. He doesn't even know what he's signing. I'd jolt awake, drenched in sweat, gripping the sheets like a drowning man clinging to a rope. The humiliation didn't end at my doorstep. It followed me like a shadow into the digital world. On Facebook, a blurry photo of me carrying groceries was posted to the town group. Beneath it, comments bloomed like weeds. Bless her heart, helping him at his age. He only cares about money, not family. Poor man, losing it so fast. The cruelest one had dozens of likes. Our town's confused grandpa. I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the screen's cold glow, feeling like my entire life had been reduced to a punchline. And then came the memes. Someone cropped my face from a church fundraiser photo, slapped a caption over it. Forgot his own name but remembers his bank account. Teenagers passed it around like candy, laughing on the sidewalks as I walked by. My grandson once scrolled past it on his phone. He didn't notice me watching. My chest tightened so hard I thought my heart might stop right there. Even the radio wasn't safe. One morning, the local DJ chuckled. Some seniors just can't admit when it's time to step aside. He didn't say my name, but I knew. Everyone knew. The callers agreed one after another, their voices like nails being driven into my coffin. By the time I turned the dial off, my ears rang with their certainty. I was done. Useless. Finished. But here's the thing. Deep down, I knew I wasn't finished. My hands might shake, but my mind still carried the blueprints of every house I'd ever built. My memory still held the smell of sawdust, the rhythm of a hammer, the sound of my boy's laughter when I bought him his first glove. Those things were real. No document, no whisper, no cruel Facebook post could erase that truth unless I let them. And that was the war inside me, not just fighting them, but fighting the seed of doubt they had planted. Some nights I'd mutter to myself, I know who I am. I know who I am, as though repetition alone could shield me from their lies. Other nights I'd lose the battle, staring at the ceiling, wondering if maybe they were right. Maybe I was slipping. Maybe my wife's voice was fading because my mind was too. That thought terrified me more than death. Still, I found small anchors. My neighbor, an old man himself, shuffled into my garage one evening and said plainly, I know you're sharp. I've seen you fix engines blindfolded. You're not what they say. His words hit harder than any accusation. For the first time in weeks, I felt seen. Not pitied. Seen. That night, I sat by my wife's photograph. I told her out loud, they want me erased. But if even one person still believes in me, maybe that's enough to fight. Her frozen smile in the frame almost seemed to nod in agreement. Maybe it was just the way the light hit the glass. Or maybe it was her. What they wanted wasn't just my property or savings. They wanted my dignity. They wanted the town to believe I was a ghost haunting my own house. And for a while, I let them convince me. But ghosts don't build houses. Ghosts don't raise sons. Ghosts don't bleed from years of work. I am no ghost. If you were in my shoes, if the people closest to you painted you as senile while the whole town clapped along, what would you do? Would you stay silent to keep the peace, or would you stand up even if it meant standing alone? Tell me below, because I had made my choice. I would fight even if the entire town thought I was already lost. The garage had always been my refuge. It smelled of motor oil and rust, the air heavy with the scent of old wood and steel. I sat there one night, the single yellow bulb overhead flickering shadows stretching long across the concrete floor. On the wall hung her photograph, my wife smiling in a way that made it feel like the world hadn't yet discovered sorrow. I stared at that photo until my eyes blurred. I could almost hear her voice, soft but firm. Don't let anyone rewrite the story of your life. Those were her last words to me. And yet, sitting there alone, I felt as though the story had already been stolen. I tried going to church the next morning, maybe habit, maybe desperation. The organ played, the hymns rose, and the sunlight streamed through stained glass in brilliant colors, but no one sat beside me. The pews around me stayed empty, as though I carried some invisible disease. People glanced my way, then quickly looked down at their hymnals. My daughter-in-law wasn't there to bridge the gap this time. Without her hand on my shoulder, without her presence to soften their judgment, I was just a stubborn old man left to rot in silence. That emptiness cut deeper than any courtroom document. It wasn't just about money or property or even freedom. It was about dignity, about belonging. And in that church, surrounded by voices lifted to heaven, I had never felt further from grace. Later that afternoon, as I sat back in the garage staring at the tools I no longer had the strength to use, I heard footsteps outside. My neighbor, an old man himself, shuffled into the doorway. His face was worn, but his eyes were steady. "I know you're sharp," he said, without preamble. "I've seen you, I've talked to you. You're not what they say." I wanted to argue, to push him away, but the lump in my throat was too thick. "They'll try to bury you," he continued, "but I'll stand up. I'll testify. Don't let them take you down without a fight." It wasn't much, just words in a dusty garage. But it was the first time in weeks someone had spoken to me like I was still whole. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling of my red brick home. The bricks held strong, but inside I felt hollow. My lawyer's words echoed in my head. Tens of thousands of dollars. A year, maybe more. In this state, guardianship is strict. The math didn't add up. Even if I won, I could lose everything to fees and filings. So why fight? Why not just let it go? Let them take over. Let the whispers become truth. Because then it wouldn't just be my money. It would be my story, my legacy. Every long night, every calloused hand, every sacrifice my wife and I made, it would all be rewritten as the tragedy of an old man who couldn't accept his decline. I couldn't let that be the ending. I don't know if it was pride or stubbornness or the ghost of my wife's voice ringing in my ears. Maybe it was the simple truth that I had nothing left to lose but the truth itself. As the house settled into silence and the night pressed against the windows, I made my decision. I would fight. Not just for the bricks and the savings and the scraps of paper with my name on them. I would fight for the story of my life, the one they were trying to erase. And if it cost me everything, so be it. Alone at night, I stared at his wife's photograph. Was he truly losing grip? Or were there lies seeping into his mind? In a half-dream, he heard both his wife's voice and his daughter-in-law's whispers tangled together. He woke drenched in sweat, whispering to himself, "I know who I am. I know who I am." Hiring a new lawyer was the first bold step I took after weeks of humiliation. My old attorney, cautious and gray, had already whispered that maybe settling quietly would save me from further embarrassment. But I wasn't looking for quiet. I was looking for justice. Quiet was how they buried you alive. The new lawyer was different. Young, sharp-eyed, restless, with the kind of energy that refused to be intimidated. His name was Coleman. When I sat across from him, the hum of fluorescent lights overhead, he didn't look at me with pity. He looked at me like a man with a fight worth taking on. "Mediation is an option," he said, fingers tapping the desk. "It's cheaper, quicker. But if you want to go all the way, we'll need proof, hard evidence." I met his gaze without flinching. "I'm not here to buy peace. I'm here to keep my life. We fight." That single word fight changed everything. The garage, once my refuge, became a war room. The smell of oil and rust mixed with the fresh ink of printed documents. Stacks of photocopies, notarized seals, and letters lined my workbench. Coleman dropped by with legal pads covered in scrawled notes, strategy sessions stretching late into the night. My neighbor, old Mr. Harlan, shuffled in with steady eyes and said, "I'll testify. I'll tell the court I've seen you sharp." Let them try to deny it. His promise was like a torch in the darkness. But the greatest risk came from my son. For weeks he played the loyal husband, standing beside her, silent as a shadow. I thought he was lost to me. Then one night he called me, voice trembling, asking me to meet him behind the lumber yard. The air smelled of sawdust and damp earth when I arrived. He stood there, shoulders slumped, a half-empty bottle of bourbon dangling from his hand. "I can't keep doing this," he muttered, eyes red. He pulled something from his jacket pocket, a small USB drive barely bigger than a thumb. "I've been recording. Cameras in the kitchen. You need to see this." For a moment I couldn't breathe. My hands shook as I took it, feeling like he had handed me the weight of redemption itself. Later that night in the garage, I plugged it into my old laptop. The blue glow of the screen lit the dark room, and there she was. My daughter-in-law, seated at the kitchen table, pen scratching across papers as she copied my signature over and over. She cursed when it didn't match sheets crumpled at her feet. Another clip showed her whispering to the doctor, "Make sure to write progressive decline. The judge won't question it." My stomach turned. The truth was finally captured. But then came the moment that froze my blood. She paused mid-sentence, eyes narrowing, and looked directly at the hidden camera. For a heartbeat, I thought it was over, that she'd rip the device out of the wall and everything would vanish. She stepped closer, face filling the screen, her breath fogging the lens. Then, just as suddenly, she turned away, muttering something I couldn't hear. My lungs released the breath I hadn't realized I was holding. My son's voice broke through the silence. He had been standing behind me the whole time. "Dad, I've failed you before. The whole town thinks I'm worthless, and maybe they're right. But I couldn't let her destroy you, not like this." I turned, and for the first time in years I looked at him, not as the boy who disappointed me, but as the man who might just save me. From that moment, the war wasn't mine alone. We had evidence, we had a witness, we had a chance. The days that followed were a blur of preparation. My lawyer examined the footage, piecing it together like a weapon. My neighbor, the one who had sworn he'd testify, came by to review his statement. "I'll tell the court what I've seen," he promised, voice steady. Even my son, still pale with fear, agreed to appear if it came to that. "She'll hate me," he muttered. "Maybe she'll leave me." Maybe I said. But the truth has a way of surviving even when love doesn't. We gathered documents, made copies, outlined strategies. The garage became a war room. Every time I felt doubt creep in, I looked at my wife's photograph and remembered her words. "Don't let anyone rewrite the story of your life." The night before the preliminary hearing, I sat alone in the living room. The red bricks of the house glowed faintly in the lamplight. Outside, cicadas hummed in the dark. I thought of the years of sweat that had built these walls, the laughter that once filled them, the sacrifices that kept them standing. They wanted to reduce it all to a stack of papers and a signature forged in secret. Not if I had anything to say about it. I rose from my chair, my voice steady even though no one was there to hear it. "If they think I'll disappear quietly, they've chosen the wrong man." That night I tried to steady his hand and write in a journal, hoping the act would prove his clarity. But the pen shook letters uneven, making him doubt himself further. He dreamed of his wife calling from the garden, but her words blurred into his daughter-in-law's harsh whisper, "He doesn't know what he's signing." The dream left him gasping, torn between love and betrayal, between memory and accusation. The courtroom was packed to the brim, neighbors, reporters, even the local pastor. Every bench groaned under the weight of curiosity and judgment. For weeks I had been the town's whispered tragedy. Now I stood at the center of its stage. Coleman slid the USB into the projector. The lights dimmed and the screen flickered to life. Gasps rippled as the footage played. My daughter-in-law hunched over the kitchen table, copying my signature again and again, cursing under her breath. Then, in hushed tones with the doctor, "Make sure you write progressive decline. He won't know a thing." The silence in the courtroom was heavy enough to choke. Reporters scribbled furiously. Neighbors who once crossed the street to avoid me now stared in disbelief. The judge leaned forward, glasses slipping down his nose. This alone could invalidate. But before he could finish, she sprang to her feet. "Emily, my daughter-in-law." Her hands trembled, but her voice cut like a blade. "You think a cheap video erases legal truth?" she snapped, lifting a sealed document high. This, she slammed it onto the desk, is a notarized will, signed, stamped, untouchable. For a moment the room froze, the weight of paper against the weight of proof, and for a heartbeat I felt the ground slip again, as though everything we'd gathered might crumble beneath her boldness. Then from the back of the courtroom, a voice rang out. Mrs. Johnson, the very neighbor who had once whispered against me, stepped forward, clutching her purse. "I was there," she said, voice shaking. "She begged me to lie, to say he forgot my name. I did once. I won't again." Another gasp surged through the crowd. The balance shifted. Emily's face drained of color. My son, once silent, rose beside me. His voice cracked but carried, "Dad may forget a hymn, but he never forgot integrity. I nearly lost mine by staying quiet. No more." The gavel struck. Enough. This fight will be long and costly, but it will be fought in the open. As cameras flashed and voices erupted, I knew one thing: the war for my dignity had only just begun. The gavel's echo still rang in my ears long after the crowd dispersed. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed like bees, shouting questions I had no strength to answer. Cameras flashed, microphones shoved toward my face. Some wanted to know about the video. Others wanted to know whether I trusted my own son. I kept walking, each step heavier than the last, until the noise faded behind me. The next morning, 2 headlines hit the town like twin hammers. One paper printed, "Old man vindicated by secret recording." Another countered, "Elder at risk of delusion, court battle looms." People read whichever headline fit the story they wanted to believe. At the cafe, I saw 2 farmers nearly come to blows, one insisting Emily was a fraud, the other shouting that I was a stubborn relic clinging to money. For the first time, the town was divided. Online, the Facebook group lit up like wildfire. Dozens of comments piled under a blurry photo of me leaving court. "He should step aside. He's hurting his family." "No, open your eyes." "She forged his name. He looks confused." Poor man. That's not confusion. That's courage. I scrolled through them at my kitchen table, heart pounding. For months, every voice had been against me. Now, for the first time, I saw strangers, neighbors I barely knew, defending me. It was a strange kind of hope, fragile but real. Walking down Main Street that afternoon, I overheard 2 groups of teenagers arguing outside the diner. One mocked me as the town ghost, the other said, "At least he's fighting." Their words clashed like sparks, and I realized the story was no longer just mine. It belonged to the whole town now. Back at my red brick house, the garage smelled of oil and rust, steady and familiar. I stared at the photo of my wife pinned to the wall. "We're not done," I whispered. "For years they told our story for us. Now finally they have to hear mine." Her frozen smile seemed to glow in the dim light. That night the phone rang. The voice on the other end was low, rough, distorted, as if run through static. "Stop pushing," it said. "Drop this fight or you won't like what comes next." The line went dead before I could speak. I sat in silence, the dial tone buzzing in my ear. For months they had tried to erase me with whispers. Now someone was trying to silence me with threats. That night, while I sat in my garage staring at shadows, another battle raged across town inside my son's home. Emily stormed through the front door, slamming it so hard the picture frames rattled. "You betrayed me," she hissed, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. She threw the folded will onto the table papers, scattering like wounded birds. "Do you realize what you've done? That video doesn't just embarrass me, it destroys us." My son stood silent, shoulders heavy, staring at the floor. He didn't argue. He didn't defend me outright. But he didn't side with her either. The silence between them was louder than any fight. "You'll lose everything," she pressed on her hands, trembling with fury. "This house, our reputation, me." She yanked the wedding ring from her finger, held it up, then slammed it on the table. The metal clink echoed through the room like a final verdict. He looked at the ring, his jaw tightening, but still he didn't pick it up. In his mind, memories churned his father's rough hands lifting him after a ball game, carrying him home in the rain. His father working double shifts so he could have a new glove. His father sitting alone at church while whispers painted him a ghost. Emily's voice pierced again. "Choose, it's me or him." He finally looked up, eyes red. "It's not that simple," he muttered. His voice cracked softer now. "It's about truth. And I'm done pretending I don't see it. Emily's face twisted, caught between rage and fear. She turned away, leaving the ring on the table. The slam of the bedroom door shook the walls. Alone in the silence, my son sank into a chair, burying his face in his hands. His phone buzzed on the table. He picked it up, opened a blank message, and stared at the screen for a long time before typing. Dad, I'll stand with you at the next hearing, no matter what. He hit send, the glow of the phone reflecting in his wet eyes. For the first time in years, he chose me, not her. If it were you, would you trust the law on paper or the truth of a father's fight? Share your thoughts below, and don't forget to subscribe for what comes next. Thank you for watching.